I was backing up my husband's old phone to a new cloud account when a voicemail played automatically through the car speakers, one I'd never heard before, buried in a folder from 3 years back. It was his voice. His exact voice, the one I'd fallen asleep next to for 7 years. Except it wasn't saying anything he would ever say. Just check the calendar. You're me through Thursday, I'm me again? Friday? She still doesn't suspect a thing. Don't mess up the signature on the mortgage papers again, you know how she checks. I sat in my driveway with the engine still running, replaying it 4 times, my hands going numb around the steering wheel. Because there was only one person in the world with a voice identical to my husband's. And that person wasn't supposed to exist. Daniel didn't have a brother. Daniel had told me the very first month we dated that he was an only child that his parents had tried for years before he came along, and never had another kid after him. I'd met his mother a dozen times over 7 years of marriage. She'd never once mentioned a second son. I sat there staring at my phone screen at a voicemail time-stamped 3 years ago from a number saved simply as D. And I understood with a cold, sliding dread that I needed to ask myself a question I never in a million years thought I'd have to ask about my own husband. Which one had I actually been married to this whole time? If you think you know where this story is going, trust me you don't, because what I found over the next month was so much bigger and so much stranger than an affair or a lie. Stick around till the end, because this one has a twist you will not see coming. My name is Priya. Daniel and I met at a mutual friend's engagement party, married 2 years later, and had spent the last 7 years building a life that on paper and in practice looked genuinely good. He worked as a structural engineer for a firm downtown. I taught middle school science. We had a modest house with a garden. I was proud of a golden retriever named Biscuit, and Sunday mornings that always involved him making slightly too strong coffee, and both of us doing the crossword badly together. Daniel had always been in the specific way I now understand, meant something more than I realized, a man of small, consistent patterns. He liked his eggs a particular way. He always parked in the same spot at work. But there were things over the years that I'd noticed and quietly filed away as quirks rather than clues. Sometimes for stretches of a few days, he'd seem slightly different, a little more formal in how he talked. Forgetting small inside jokes we'd built over years once. Even asking me half-joking I assumed what my mother's name was again, 3 years into our marriage. He'd blame exhaustion work, stress, a bad night's sleep. I believed him every single time, because why on earth wouldn't I? There were also stretches unpredictable, and never explained clearly, where Daniel would tell me he needed to visit his mother alone sometimes for a few days at a time. Family stuff. Always vague, always delivered with a specific kind of gentle finality that discouraged follow-up questions. His mother, Eleanor, lived 2 states away in a quiet town I'd only visited a handful of times, always for short, oddly choreographed visits, where I never quite got the sense I was seeing her whole life. I never once thought to question any of it. 7 years is a long time to build trust, and I'd built mine on 1,000 small, ordinary days that all felt completely real. The voicemail wasn't the very first crack I realized later once I started actually looking back. It was just the first one loud enough that I couldn't explain it away. I didn't say anything to Daniel that night. I told him I had a headache and went to bed early, lying awake next to a man whose voice I now heard differently every time he spoke, listening for some tiny inconsistency I couldn't have named even if I'd found one. The next morning, I did something I'd never done in 7 years of marriage. I went through his closet properly, not snooping, exactly just looking, really looking for the first time. Most of it was exactly what I expected. But tucked in a shoebox on the top shelf behind a stack of old sweaters, I found a small, worn leather journal that wasn't in Daniel's handwriting. It was close to his handwriting, close enough that I might never have questioned it on any ordinary day. But the letter T was crossed differently sharper, and the whole thing slanted a few degrees more than Daniel's actual writing did. I'd spent 7 years reading his grocery lists and birthday cards. I knew his handwriting the way you know a face. Inside, dated entries stretched back nearly 5 years, written in a voice that sounded almost exactly like Daniel's inner monologue, but carried a weight and edge that felt slightly off. One entry read, "Another week as him. Getting easier every time, which honestly scares me more than it should." Another further back, "Mom says we have to keep doing this until the Whitcomb thing is fully behind us. I hate lying to her every single day. She deserves better than a husband who's only half real most of the time." I read that line probably a dozen times. A husband who's only half real most of the time. I sat on our bedroom floor with that journal in my lap and understood in a slow, sickening wave that I hadn't married one man who occasionally acted strange. I'd married something else entirely, something I didn't yet have a full shape for, but that I now knew with absolute certainty involved two people wearing one name. I stayed on that floor for what felt like an hour, going back through the journal entries, in order watching a timeline take shape that made my whole 7 years feel suddenly unstable underneath me. There was an entry from our wedding week itself, 4 days before the ceremony, that read, "D wants to do the vows himself, obviously, but asked me to be ready for the reception in case Mom's cousins from the Whitcomb side show up unexpected, better safe." She'll never know the difference at a reception that big, that loud, that many hands to shake. I remember reading that line and physically flinching like I'd been slapped, thinking about every photo from that reception, wondering for the very first time which brother was in which one. There was another entry, gentler, that stopped me even harder. She cried today over something small, a bad grade one of her students got, and I didn't know what to do, because Daniel usually knows exactly what to say, and I just held her instead. I think that might have actually been the right thing to do. I think I might be better at this than I expected to be, which terrifies me more than anything else about this whole arrangement. I didn't know reading it whether to feel comforted or violated. Both feelings arrived at once and never fully separated again. I decided sitting there on that floor that I wasn't going to confront Daniel with half a picture. Whatever this actually was, I needed the whole thing before I said a single word, because I had a growing, uncomfortable feeling that whoever was in this house with me that week might not even be the one I should be confronting first. I called Eleanor, directly my mother-in-law, using a voice as normal as I could manage, and asked her casually whether she still had old family photo albums from when Daniel was little, something I could look through for a scrapbook project, I said. She hesitated in a way I'd never heard from her before. A long, careful pause before saying she'd have to look, that some boxes had gotten disorganized over the years. That hesitation told me everything. I drove the 4 hours to her house the next day without telling Daniel, using a work excuse I'd never used before in my life. Eleanor met me at her door looking like a woman who'd been dreading this exact conversation for years. I didn't have to ask much. I just told her what I'd found, the voicemail, the journal, and watched her whole face collapse into something between relief and dread, the specific look of someone finally putting down a weight they'd been carrying alone for far too long. She told me the truth in pieces, the way people do when a secret has calcified over years into something almost unspeakable. Daniel had a twin brother, Marcus. Identical down to the voice, down to a rare small birthmark behind the left ear that almost nobody ever noticed. They'd been raised together until their late 20s, close as twins often are, until Marcus had gotten involved in a bad business deal, something involving a man named Whitcomb, a financial scheme that had gone badly wrong, ending in a death that Marcus swore and Eleanor believed had been an accident, not anything intentional. Marcus had gone into hiding under Daniel's identity for what was supposed to be a few months, just long enough for the situation to cool for a specific set of people connected to Whitcomb to lose interest or move on. A few months had become years, and somewhere along the way, according to Eleanor, the arrangement had become something neither brother had ever planned for, tangled up completely with the fact that Daniel had, in the middle of all of it, fallen in love with me, and Marcus, taking his brother's place for stretches at a time, apparently had too. I drove home that night in a kind of numb, mechanical silence, replaying 7 years of my marriage on an endless loop, trying to figure out which memories belonged to which man. I started going back through everything with new eyes. The stretches where Daniel forgot small details about us, where he seemed slightly more formal, slightly colder, those had been Marcus. The trips to visit his mother alone, those were the handoffs, the brothers swapping places, coordinating schedules like some horrifying elaborate relay race with my entire life as the baton being passed back and forth. I found the mortgage papers. Eleanor's voicemail memory had mentioned papers I'd signed years earlier for our house, and noticed once I actually looked closely that Daniel's signature on two of the pages was subtly, almost imperceptibly different from the rest, the same sharper T, the same slightly steeper slant I'd found in that journal. I called our bank using a story about needing to verify old documents and asked for the exact dates those two pages had been notarized. They matched almost precisely with two of the visiting his mother trips. Eleanor's own calendar, which she'd shown me reluctantly before I left her house, had marked as M home instead of D home. I found photographs too, going back through years of albums with a magnifying glass I didn't know I needed until that week, small telling differences if you knew to look. A slightly different way of holding a coffee mug. A left-handed signature on one wedding guestbook page versus a right-handed one on another. Something I'd never once thought to notice because why would anyone? The scariest part wasn't even the swapping itself once I fully understood the shape of it. It was realizing that at some point, 7 years in, I could no longer say with any confidence which brother I'd actually promised forever to at our wedding altar. Both had apparently been in that church that day, taking turns coordinating a swap sometime during the reception that neither Eleanor nor I suspected either brother had ever planned to tell me about. I called our wedding photographer that same week, an older woman named Corinne, who still had every original file archived from 7 years back, and asked her with a story about wanting high-resolution copies for an anniversary project to send over the full unedited set instead of just the album highlights we'd chosen at the time. Going through hundreds of raw, unposed shots, I found a 15-minute gap in the timestamps, right in the middle of cocktail hour, where the man in every photo before it and the man in every photo after it were subtly, unmistakably not standing, gesturing, or smiling in quite the same way. In one photo before the gap, Daniel held his champagne glass loosely in his left hand while talking to my uncle. In every single photo after he held it in his right. I sat with my laptop that night clicking back and forth between those two photographs until the screen blurred, trying to decide whether I was more frightened by how easily I'd missed it for 7 straight years or by how easily apparently absolutely everyone else at my own wedding had missed it too. I confronted whoever was living in my house that week on a Thursday evening, sitting him down at the kitchen table with the journal, the voicemail transcript, the mortgage pages, and 7 years of quietly reorganized memories laid out between us. He didn't try to lie, not once I made it clear exactly how much I already knew. He told me in a voice I now understood carried 2 different men inside it that he was Marcus, that Daniel was actually 2 states away that week staying with a cousin unaware I'd found any of this yet. Marcus told me the rest of it, filling in the gaps Eleanor's careful protective version had left out. The Whitcomb situation had never fully resolved the way they'd hoped. There'd been a settlement years back, quiet handled through lawyers, that was supposed to close the whole thing permanently, but a resurfacing civil claim 18 months ago had reignited the danger, at least enough that the brothers had decided together to keep the arrangement going, rather than risk exposing which of them had actually been present the night Whitcomb died. And then Marcus told me the part that actually broke something open in my chest completely differently than anything before it, that somewhere in those 7 years he'd genuinely fully fallen in love with me too, that some of the moments I remembered as some of our best an anniversary trip, a terrible flu I'd had that he'd nursed me through for 4 days straight, had actually been him, not Daniel, and that he'd spent years torn between guilt so heavy it kept him up at night, and a love he'd never planned for and couldn't make himself walk away from. I asked him the only question I actually needed answered in that moment. "Does Daniel know how you feel about me?" Marcus was quiet for a long time before he said, "He's known for 2 years. We've been fighting about it in every single handoff since." I want to be honest, there was no version of this where I got to just calmly process what I'd learned. I called Daniel that same night, told him to get home immediately, and sat both brothers down at that same kitchen table 48 hours later side by side for the first time I'd ever consciously witnessed it, watching 2 identical faces look back at me with 2 very different kinds of guilt. I didn't make a decision that night out of anger, even though I had every right to. I made calls first to a lawyer, to a therapist who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, though I doubted she'd ever handled one quite this specific, and eventually carefully to a private investigator experienced with cold case-adjacent situations who could help me understand once and for all the actual current legal risk still hanging over Marcus and by extension over our entire household. What we learned was that the Whitcomb civil claim had in fact quietly settled for good almost a year earlier, something neither brother had confirmed for certain because neither had wanted to risk directly reaching out and reopening anything. Marcus had been hiding unnecessarily for nearly 12 months, trading identities with his own brother, disrupting my entire life, and his own over a danger that no longer actually existed. I made both of them get real legal counsel to formally permanently resolve Marcus's identity separately, cleanly once and for all, so that whatever came next for any of us wouldn't be built on borrowed paperwork and swapped signatures anymore. I told them both plainly that I needed real time completely alone to figure out which parts of the last 7 years I could actually keep believing in and which parts I needed to grieve as something that had never fully been what I thought it was. It's been a year and a half since that Thursday at the kitchen table. Daniel and I are divorced now, not out of hatred, but out of a mutual exhausted understanding that too much of our marriage had happened without my full informed consent, no matter how much love had genuinely been real underneath it. Marcus and I are against every reasonable expectation I ever had for my own life together now, properly as himself under his own real name, for the first time since I've known him. It wasn't a fast decision, and it wasn't an easy one. We spent almost a year in separate careful therapy before either of us trusted the idea enough to try building something honest, instead of something borrowed. Daniel moved out of state, and we talk maybe twice a year, careful and civil, two people who loved the same woman under genuinely strange circumstances, and somehow slowly found a way not to hate each other for it. Eleanor and I are closer now than we've ever been. Oddly enough, she says, having the whole truth finally out in the open after years of carrying it alone felt like putting down a stone she'd forgotten she was even holding. I still find myself some mornings watching Marcus make coffee slightly too strong, exactly the way I remember Daniel doing it years ago, and wondering just for a second which one of them actually taught the other that habit first, or whether after enough years of trading places some things about two people simply become impossible to fully separate again. I don't know if I'll ever have a completely clean answer to who I actually married that day at the altar. What I do know is that I finally get to choose with my eyes fully open exactly who I'm building the rest of my life with. And this time, there's only one name on every signature that matters. Sometimes Biscuit still gets confused. I swear, trotting up to Marcus with the exact same head tilt she used to give Daniel on the days he'd walk in the door, like some part of even our dog never fully learned to tell the difference either. Marcus laughs about it now, softer than I think he'd have allowed himself to a year and a half ago, back when every reminder of Daniel still felt like a wound neither of us knew how to talk about out loud. If you found out the person you married for 7 years had secretly been 2 different people the entire time, would you have stayed to sort it out or walked away completely? Tell me honestly in the comments. I still don't think there's a wrong answer. If this story completely blew your mind, share it with someone who thinks they've heard every possible twist this genre has to offer. 7 years, 1 house, 2 brothers, and a single voicemail that finally told me the truth I never knew I was missing. I didn't just find out who I married. I found out how many people I actually loved without ever knowing it.